right, welcome to day 3 of Unit 3. Today we're going to look at the effects of exploration on the Americas. So we're going to take a look at how did things change in the Americas, how did things change back in Europe, if anything changed at all. But specifically we're looking at how things changed here in the Americas once these explorers came and they explored. So there is no doubt that the colonization of the Americas drastically changed the world. We see voluntary and forced migration or movement of millions of people. This led to new and powerful societies being created. This colonization results in the exchange not only of ideas and cultures, but new items as well. These exchanges of new items, it impacts people throughout the world. And the new wealth that people experience, especially in Europe, it led to new business and trade practices. All right, so first things first. On your notes, please correct the labels on the boxes. So the box on the left should be labeled Europe, Asia, and Africa to the Americas. And the box on the right should be labeled Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Okay, so the arrows should be like, imagine if Europe is over here, which if you're looking at a map it is, and the Americas are over here. So this arrow is going to represent all the things that were coming across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Okay, same one with this one. Imagine that this is stuff that is going to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's coming from the Americas. Okay, so get those boxes corrected in your notes, please. Okay. All right, so just above that box, though, I want you to write down what the Columbian Exchange is. It's defined as the transfer of foods, plants, and animals during the colonization of the Americas. Take a moment and write these items down in the now correctly labeled boxes. Yes, you need to list them all. You're going to have quiz and test questions about what products came from where. So go ahead and click pause now and get those items written down. Okay, so you should have all of these written down. Basically what happens is that ships from the Americas would sail to Europe and Asia with foods, plants, and animals. Once in Europe and Asia, these items would come off the ships and they would add items from these places, from Europe or Asia or Africa, and take them back to the Americas. So ships coming from the Americas would take such amazing fruits and vegetables like tomatoes, potatoes, pineapple, and cacao, which is where chocolate comes from, and turkeys. So, and they would take them over to the old world. Okay, there were no turkeys or no cacao beans or no, like if you look on the screen, no pumpkins, no squash, no tomatoes. None of that stuff was over in Europe or Africa or Asia prior to this age of exploration or age of discovery. So prior to Europeans coming to the New World, to the Americas, there were no things like wheat or grain or rice or oats or plants like bananas, no black-eyed peas, no yams, no animals like pigs or sheep or cattle or horses. Those are all things that originated over in Europe, Asia, and Africa. So we have an agricultural and livestock exchange happening between the two hemispheres of the world. Now, while having fruits and vegetables and animals are a good and delicious effect of the Columbian Exchange, not all of the effects were positive. So diseases also came over on those ships, and is as if having the conquistadors and other explorers coming to quote-unquote discover and claim your country wasn't bad enough, something as simple as the common cold could completely wipe out native populations. So now that you know what the Columbian Exchange is, let's look at what some of the effects of it were. You're going to need to write down 4 of them as we go through today. So Europeans have been introduced to some of the New World plants, and they desire more and more of these fruits and vegetables. So this results in a shortage of labor in the Americas. This shortage leads to the use of African slaves. Now, understand that prior to 1500, slavery had existed in Africa for centuries. Now, while it was not a major institution of their society, it did exist. And in most cases, slaves had some rights and an opportunity for social mobility, meaning that there were ways for Africans to escape their bondage, quite different than the way that they were treated here in the Americas. So back to the Americas. As I mentioned before, there was a huge demand for these New World items. Because there was a shortage of labor, plantation owners looked for cheap labor and found it in African slaves. Europeans saw positive aspects of using African slaves. So for one, they had already been exposed to so many of the different European diseases, they had built up immunity to them. Also, Africans were not familiar with this new land that they were being taken to, so they were less likely to try to escape. If they don't know where they're going, they're most likely not going to try to escape. Another advantage that they thought to having African slaves was that many of the slaves already had experience with farming, so they could easily be taught plantation work. So what is it that you absolutely have to have written down for this? It's the first effect, and it is that shortage of labor results in the use of African slaves. So I mentioned a plantation. Well, what is a plantation? What you see on your screen is a very typical plantation in the South. It's basically it's a very large farm that's used for growing plants like cotton or wheat or corn or rice. It's certainly not a small family farm. Okay, so we see a switch from where you farm just to take care of yourself and your family to where we are now having these great big huge farms and we're trying to farm for profit. It requires the labor of many, many people. So when Europeans realized they need people to work on these plantations, they turned to slaves and at other times natives as well. This results in the decimation of the native economic systems as well as damaged the environment. And that's exactly what you need to write down. The plantation system ruined the economic systems that were already in place in the Americas as well as had negative impacts on the environment. Okay, our third effect, you should remember that diseases were also part of the Columbian Exchange. Not intentionally, of course, but diseases did manage to make their ways across the Atlantic Ocean. Diseases like smallpox, typhus, malaria, influenza, diphtheria, and measles resulted in the death of millions of Native Americans. A Spanish missionary in Mexico, Bernardino de Saguan, he described the impact of smallpox on Aztecs like this. So this is what he said. There was great havoc. Very many died of it. They could not walk. They could not move. They could not stir, meaning they couldn't turn over. They couldn't just be restless in their bed or on their cot. They could not change position, not lie on one side, nor face down, not on their backs. And if they stirred, much did they cry out. Great was its destruction. So those are the words of a man who actually was there experiencing the smallpox epidemic firsthand. He saw the way that it affected the natives, and you can see here that this is an illustration of what it looked like to a native back then. So here's your takeaway from this. Diseases like smallpox ultimately are what wiped out the Aztec and the Incan civilizations. I know you remember that we had explorers like Pizarro and Cortez that came over, and they certainly did not treat the natives well. And that when they took over, we start to see the demise. That was the beginning of the fall of their civilizations. But once these diseases hit, it just completely wipes them out. So you know that Africans were used as slaves, but you also need to know that Native Americans were too. Oftentimes, Europeans arrived in the New World and viewed themselves as being so superior to these savage groups because they didn't look the same or speak the same or even worship the same. So because of these many native cultures that they weren't as technologically advanced, it was quite easy for them to be taken over by the Europeans. And so once the Europeans came in and took over, they enslaved the natives in many cases. So because we see that Europeans are viewing themselves as superior, we begin to see changes in native cultures as well. So here's your fourth effect. Colonies began taking on the culture of the mother country. For example, native tribes in modern-day Mexico were forced to become Catholic and to speak Spanish. If you think about Canada, you should remember that Jacques Cartier was the French explorer who named Canada, and he also explored the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. In Canada, they speak French. Okay, same for what was going on in the 13 colonies. Natives there were forced to speak English. So here's a clue for how to remember what mother country settled where. Ask yourself this. What language do they speak? Okay, so in the U.S., we speak English. We were settled by England. Mexico, if people live in Mexico, Mexicans, they speak Spanish. They were settled by Spain. Brazilians in South America, they speak Portugal they speak Portuguese because they were settled by Portugal. So again, we see where the colonies they're beginning to take on the mother country's culture as well. So they're beginning to worship like Europeans. They are beginning to dress like Europeans. They're starting to talk like them. We see all of these changes coming to their cultures, okay? All right, so that wraps up your day 3. You should have all of the items written down for the Columbian Exchange, what came and went from both places. You should also have written down what were the 4 effects of the European exploration. How did it affect the Americas? Next class, we're going to go on and we're going to go on and talk about and look and see how the exploration, how it affected the rest of the world. So it's not just going to impact Europe and the Americas, but it is going to go on and impact the whole rest of the world too. So we'll see you then.